It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker and the subject of today's talk. But before I do that, I thought I'd better introduce myself, as I will be probably unknown to quite a few of you. I've joined Balliol only a year ago. My name is Jennifer Slivka. I'm the keeper of Western art at the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Archaeology, so just across the street from Balliol College, where I'm also a professorial fellow. My particular specialism is Italian Renaissance and Baroque art. And even though I continue to research and publish on that subject, for the last 8 or 9 years or so, I've become interested in transhistorical projects. So those are projects that might take a particular technique or a motif or a subject and trace it across time. So for example, I've done a number of publications and exhibitions that look at a subject such as painting in black and white and trace that over the course of 700 years. And these are the projects that I think are a particularly exciting way to look at pieces of knowledge, because they cut through chronologies and they think about different people at different times and what that motif came to mean for a particular culture and how it transformed over time. And that makes me particularly excited to introduce today's talk, because it is very much a transhistorical subject. And just before I do that, I wanted to share my screen, because I think this gives you a little sense of a little flavor of what we're about to talk about. This is Robin Choudhury's very impressive, I would say, new book published in the autumn of 2024, The Beating Heart, the Art and Science of Our Most Vital Organ. I suspect that Professor Choudhury has been familiar to most of you as a professional and cardiovascular professional, but also a fellow of Balliol College. What I think is particularly exciting about this project, and I'll come to sort of give you a brief overview of the book in a minute, is that it really seems to me, and Robin, you can correct me on this, it seems a project that really grows out of the people and connections of Balliol College, which seems particularly rich. So of course, Robin, you've had an interest in the heart, both how it works, but also its representation for a very long time. But from what I understand, there is another professor who belongs to Balliol, Elena Lombardi, who gave you this book on medieval representations of the heart very early on. And then she introduced you to one of my colleagues at the Ashmolean Museum, Dr. Jim Harris. And he too had this particular interest and started pulling out objects from the Ashmolean Museum that the both of you really got excited about. And that rather beautifully transformed into a kind of seminar or a study day in 2013, where you focused particularly on the historic representations of the heart and understanding, I guess, human understanding of the heart over several centuries. What I think is particularly exciting and extraordinary, an achievement in this book, is that you cover 4 millennia of the history of representation and understanding of the heart. It's something I never achieved in my transhistorical exhibitions. I've done 700 years, I've done 3,000 years, but 4,000 is an exceptional overview. And the way this is done in the book is really seamless and accessible and brilliantly written. You can really sit down and read this book from cover to cover. It's an extraordinary journey you take us on. And essentially you begin, as this slide will suggest, in ancient Egypt with the weighing of the heart. And then you take us on kind of extraordinary journey where we then are transferred to medieval Europe, and then we're in Renaissance Italy, and then we're in kind of 17th century Oxford, which plays a critical role, of course. And then we're in kind of 18th century representations from Mexico and the Sacred Heart into the modern era, where you do really interesting discussion of artists like Frida Kahlo and Edvard Munch. You help us see how important the motif and the subject of the heart are in those great, great artists. And then taking us right through to the contemporary. And the way I kind of understood your final chapter, the contemporary heart, is really a kind of epilogue. So it looks both backwards of where we've come and where we're going and where we are right now that I thought was really very moving in so many ways. So I congratulate you in advance of taking on this extraordinary subject, and you really take us on wonderful adventures. And I'm really looking forward to discussing this with you a little bit further in the moment. The structure of today's or this evening's talk will be that I'm going to hand over to Robin, who's going to give us a nice overview of the entire book with some beautiful illustrations. And then he and I are going to do a little bit of a dialogue, a little in conversation, as they say. I've brought some images for us to discuss. Robin doesn't know, but I've included a surprise object that he's never seen that has intrigued me, and I want to ask him about it. And then we will open up for questions from all of you, from the audience, and I will chair those questions, and I will try and ensure that all of you get the chance to ask Robin your questions. So I think that's enough from me for now. I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass on over to you, Robin.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Can I just confirm you can see that screen?
We can.
Okay. So Jennifer, thanks. That's a very generous introduction, and I'm very excited to be doing this with you. And I hope that we can cover some really interesting ground because, like you, I think it's a very rich subject, and you are quite right that this project has a very, very strong Balliol connection from its origins with Eleanor Lombardi, but as we'll see also, Denis Noble has a very, very key role in the whole story. And you're absolutely right to point out the catalytic role that Timothy Wilson played early on. So it's a very Balliol College rich encounter. Well, what I want to do today is to really cover some of the story in a way that brings out what I think are some of the more intriguing elements of this heart story. And by that, I mean, I want to knit together how the heart has been seen across cultures and across time and bring forward some of the considerations around the secular heart. For instance, as we frequently encounter in love motifs, the sacred heart across many cultures. There is a philosophical element to the heart, and interwoven with it all is, if you like, the natural history, which becomes the science of the heart. And those things are not separate. And I want to try to avoid sharp delineations between those considerations. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is how the heart has been seen in common across culture and across time. So as the seat of the soul, as the source of love, as the recorder of deeds, as the dwelling place of gods, as the source of semen, as the source of life. These are things that come back and back across cultures and often from seemingly unrelated origins. So where to start, where to look for the origin of life? And Aristotle looked inside a fertilized chick egg, and there on the surface of the egg could see the very first rumbling, first stirring of life, which was the beating heart, just this red nascent organ sitting on the surface of the egg, but moving. And it's the movement of the heart and the fact that the heart beats that I believe, and I make the case, and I will make the case today, underlies this intense fascination. It's the idea that the heart somehow lives within us, but is also somehow apart from us, and it reports back to us in times of passion and fear and love. And so we have a relationship with the heart that imbues it with some sort of mystery, particularly if you don't really understand its physiological role. So I'm going to start with an anachronistic image. This is a 19th century depiction of a medicalized heart, if you like, and it's the heart in the cardiovascular system, as distinct from the circulatory system, that Galen envisaged. And what we can see here is Galen's idea, wherein blood was made in the liver, passed on to the heart, and then it flowed to the tissues, slowly ebbed and flowed to the tissues where it was consumed. The blood that was made in the liver was so-called vivified by contacting air that came in from the lungs. And to do that, and I emphasize this because we're going to come back to it, Galen postulated that there were certain pores in between the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart. And that way of seeing the heart in a, if you like, medical sense, though not represented in diagrammatic form, hung over the understanding, the physiological understanding, if you like, of the heart for around 1500 years. The first anatomical depictions of the heart are seen here. There is a manuscript in Caius College, Cambridge, and in the Ashmolean, in the Bodleian, which is Ashmolean manuscript 399. And these are very early anatomical images wherein the text is not merely illuminated, but is actually illustrated. So these are working scientific diagrams, if you like, and they show in diagrammatic form what is referred to in the text. And you can see something like the image that I showed you a few moments ago. This is the arterial system in the so-called 5-figure series. So these branching fronded vessels are the arteries. It's a little counterintuitive to a contemporary eye where we show arteries as red and veins as blue. But nonetheless, we can clearly see some sort of branching structure. And the other thing that I want to draw to your attention is something which recurs. It's this black dot inside the heart, the so-called granum nigrans. And that doesn't exist in any anatomical form. It is there, it's disputed what it refers to. Maybe it's the origin of the branching structures, maybe it's the source of the soul. There are various references in the literatures. But that idea of the black spot in the heart is something which is one of the intuited features that crosses cultures, and we will come back to it later. The way that the heart in this form came into Western anatomical drawings was through the Arabic scholars who took the classical writing of Galen, of Aristotle, of Hippocrates, and translated it into accessible Latin in the 12th century. And it came into Europe, as so many texts did, through the south in Italy, through Salerno, through Cordova and southern Toledo and southern what is now Spain. And then we don't have images from that period from the Arabic tradition. But what probably happened is that there was a flow backwards of anatomical images from this 13th, 14th century English version back into the Middle East. And you can see some consistency with the anatomical image that's shown here, probably from northern India in the 19th century. So these splayed forms, interestingly, the facial expressions become arguably more sophisticated over time, but you can see the anatomical forms share some consistent features, not least because they're wrong. So they've been passed on from generation to generation because they were learnt and they weren't observed. And that's an important part of what's going on in the background here. So we're going to come back to some anatomical and medical, if you like, science images, but just to give some sense of how the heart's being represented in sacred and secular life in Europe around the same time. So this is from the Scrioni Chapel in Padua. And this is an example, this is by Giotto, and it shows the virtue charity, either giving or receiving, I'm not sure, charity from God. So here is an anatomically fairly faithful heart. And I think what's fascinating is not so much that it's been given or received, but the idea that the heart contains something of importance, something of value. And that's a recurring theme. I'm not going to go into it today, but St. Catherine of Siena would also have been someone who had an idea that the heart contained something which was exchangeable or receivable from God. So here is the Botticelli of Botticelli to Banksy. This is a really fascinating image. So I said in my introductory comments that one of the features of the heart is as a container. Of course, it's a hollow organ. And the legend of St. Ignatius is that even as he faced death by crucifixion and the opportunity to save himself by renouncing his faith, he refused to do so and asked why. He said, because I have God's name inscribed within my heart. And the idea was that there were gold letters contained within St. Ignatius's heart. And here is the moment that Botticelli is showing of the incision of the heart to find the gold letters in which God's name is inscribed. And I like this particularly because it brings to mind the idea that Botticelli would not have known what the heart did, far less what the letters might look like, and has chosen to depict not the open heart, but the moment of the incision, which captures all of the fascination and the pregnancy of the moment without him having actually to commit to any particular version of what this fantastical tale might mean. So I like the mystery of this, and I like the possibility that Botticelli has captured. So beside the sacred hearts, there were also depictions of secular hearts. And here is in the center of the screen, you'll see Frau Minna, this very alluringly clad woman who is the object of chivalric love. And at the bottom right is the suitor who is professing his unrequited love. And around are all the ways in which his heart has been tortured by the object of his desire, crushed and sawn and burnt and trodden underfoot. And it's clearly a very graphic representation of the pain of love, which probably has its origins in classical text. So running hand in hand, we have the heart as a very sacred, very sacred connotations, as a container of God's word, and as a container of virtues, but also this very divorced from that idea of the heart in a secular space. Okay, so one of the things that I want to emphasize as we go along is the idea that the way that we think about the heart is very much informed by the prevailing cultural discourse of the day. And I want to start with Leonardo and the intellectual journey that Leonardo went on over about 35 years. So on the left here is the image that I've just shown you, Ashmole 399. And here is the rather basic splayed human form with the organ shown in a wrong, anatomically wrong form that reflects the writing of Galen. On the right-hand side is an early anatomical depiction by Leonardo da Vinci. And you can immediately see that it has a much more realistic appearance, the facial expression, the anatomy of the surface is much more nuanced and much more textured. But the anatomy of the internal structures is still wrong. It's still Leonardo depicting what he was told or what he had read. There's no sense in which Leonardo is trying to depict something which is accurate or which is come by through observation. So this was done in around 1485. And I mentioned again in the introductory comments that one of the common attributes of the heart was as a source of semen. And even Leonardo da Vinci is caught in this way of thinking. This is a so-called sagittal section, so cutting through the midline. And you can see that there is a pipe that clearly extends from the heart down in front of the spinal column and plumbs into the male genitalia. And there's another tube that comes from the brain down through the spinal cord and does the same. So this is a very artfully, very elegantly depicted anatomical schematic, but it's completely wrong. And it's Leonardo representing what he'd read and thinking that he had inherited. Over the course of the next 20 years or so, he starts to dissect cadavers, and he starts to really unpick what's going on as observed by his own eye. And he writes of the cadavers that he's dissected. He writes of what it's like to do that, and the detail with which he pursued this undertaking is really shown in some of the pages and pages of his anatomical notebooks, which incidentally were unpublished during his lifetime. I want to draw your attention to the anatomically faithful image on the left, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but also to the schematic on the right. And the schematic on the right is interesting because it's very much not how the heart appears. It really is a diagrammatic form. Here's the left side of the heart with its thick walls. Here is the interventricular septum, and here is the right side of the heart. And you'll recall from my introduction that I said that Galen had postulated that there were pores that linked the left side and the right side of the heart and allowed the air coming from the lungs to mix with the blood. What's interesting about this is that whilst Leonardo could have drawn the pores, he hasn't drawn the pores. He's drawn some nod or some allusion to the possibility of pores, but they seem somehow tentative and incomplete. And I think what's happening here is that that Leonardo is recognizing what he's meant to be able to see, but is also acknowledging to himself that he can't actually see these pores. One of Leonardo's many jobs was a hydrologist and a maintainer of waterways in Milan. And one of his fascinations was with flowing water, eddies of water. And he spent a lot of time drawing these vortices as water moved from one space to another or went through lock gates. And remember that in this era, and for Leonardo in particular, there was a very strong urge to unify parts of nature. So what he saw in water and waterways, he would imagine must share some common laws, some common features with what was happening in living systems. So on the right here, we can see one of the many, many pages from his notebooks, which are now held in the Royal Collection at Windsor. And one of the things that he did was to extrapolate from what he was seeing in lock gates and to speculate that the valves of the aorta might impose similar eddies of flow on blood exiting the heart as he was seeing in the lock gates. And more than that, he modeled this. So he moved away from being a mere observer and, if you like, anatomist, to being an experimentalist and to looking at function and dynamic function at that. And if you like, he was, in that sense, a proto-physiologist. The way he did this was to model an ox heart and aorta and to recreate the proximal aorta from glass. And into that model, he suspended grass seeds that would allow him to see the flux and flow of the fluid in which they were suspended as they crossed the aortic valve. And in doing that, he drew these tiny vortices just above the level of the valve. And moreover, he said something which is still not taught in medical schools today, but which is absolutely correct, which is that these vortices have a purpose, and their purpose is to close the aortic valve as the heart stops beating and starts to relax. And in closing it, it prevents the regurgitation of blood. So here you see the blood exiting the heart. Here are some vortices in the so-called aortic sinuses. And of course, he draws them very, very beautifully and in a very studied and geometric way. So about 10 years ago, we became aware of a technique called 4D magnetic resonance, in which you can tag blood exiting the heart and label its velocity, so both its speed and its directionality. So this is an aorta. You can see the blood coming from this direction and flowing down and out through the great vessels. And this was a technique that was developed at Stanford University. But it was apparent to me immediately that we could use this technique to study for the first time in a living human the possibility that Leonardo was right. So with Milenka Bissell in my lab and Erika Dalla Molina, we studied the aortic route. So now we're looking not at the whole aorta, but just at the level of the valve and above the valve. So here is the valve, below is the heart, and here is the blood exiting. And you can see that the vortices that Leonardo had drawn are delineated very precisely by this 4D imaging technique. And if we freeze these images and look sequentially through the cardiac cycle, you can see that not only are they there, but they're there in both the location and proportion that Leonardo had conjectured. What isn't there, and which is no less interesting to me, are these secondary vortices. So Leonardo was unaware of the circulation of the blood, and he speculated that these little vortices were there to dissipate heat and energy as the blood exited the heart. So he was right in the most important aspect, but was frustrated in his inability, I think, to understand quite how the whole picture fit together. So I mentioned that Leonardo's notebooks were unpublished. The mainstream medical investigation was going on in Padua and was led by this man, Vesalius. And I need to give you some idea of the brilliance and the energy of this guy, who really thought, I think, and was indeed at the forefront, not just of anatomical science, but of science of his day. And this is from the frontispiece of his seminal work, De Fabrica. And I want to make the comparison between Vesalius and Musk. I think these are guys who are young, precocious, and of enormous ambition, and had some very strong sense of their place in their contemporary world. This is what that anatomical dissection looked like before Vesalius. So here is a chap laid down on a slab, and you can see these observers somewhat uninterested by whatever's going on the dissecting table, and there's some reading going on by the reader, the professor, from the texts of the ancient anatomists, so Galen and Hippocrates. The dissection is probably little more than a demonstration of what's about to be laid open in this cadaver's abdomen and chest. This is the frontispiece for De Fabrica, and you can see that this is a completely different scene. So this is a throng of people crowding around Vesalius, who's dissecting the body. There are people craning to see from the parapets. Someone leaning from an arch here. There's even a monkey somewhere in this image. So the whole tone of scientific investigation has changed. It's become led by an individual, and it's become about observation and discovery in a way that it wasn't not 50, 60 years previously. And this idea almost of the sort of cult of the individual scientific hero, I think, is something that we can understand today, although in a sense we might rather not. Here is the dissecting theatre in Padua. It was built after Vesalius was there by his successor, Fabricius. And you can see these very steep tiers of standing room only for the visitors from all around Europe to come and see the dissecting table. So we're looking up through the dissecting table, and people would have been staring into the dissection as it took place. No seats in here. And if you go into here and look up, you get a sense of the crush in order to see and the intensity of the theatre that would have been accompanying Fabricius and his colleagues. This is the transition that the anatomical depiction took. So this is early anatomical depictions. These are rather prettified images. There are some birds flying in the background here. And this would have been done not by an anatomist, but by an artist, engraver, who was depicting some version of an anatomical image under instruction, and quite possibly would rather be doing something else. Here are the images that come from De Fabrica. These are quite different. These are anatomically correct. They show the correct representations and the relationships of the heart to the pericardium, to the trachea, and to the great vessels. So there's a very distinct transition that occurs as dissection and description emerges from first principles. So then the next great advance comes with William Harvey, who's a student of Fabricius in Padua, and has gone from London to learn about anatomy. And William Harvey, I would say, really introduces probably the preeminent concept in medicine and therapeutics, because nothing is possible without an appreciation of the circulation of the blood. So he wrote his great work, De Motu Cordis, in 1628, but he'd been working on it for 10 years previously. And the inscription of De Motu Cordis is given here. It's dedicated to Charles I. The most gracious king, the heart of creatures is the foundation of life, the prince of all, the sun of their microcosm on which all vegetation does depend, from whence all vigour and strength does flow. Likewise, the king is the foundation of the kingdoms and the sun of the microcosm, the heart of his commonwealth, from whence all power and mercy proceeds. And this is a very Aristotelian view of the world, and Harvey was an avowed Aristotelian, has the heart at the very center. And you know, Harvey was really very brilliant in his discovery, not least because he does it entirely from first principles. So he has no access to new techniques or to new machines. He doesn't use a microscope or anything um, from a technological perspective. He just cuts back to first principles. And he realizes that the proposals of Galen, which had prevailed for 1500 years, couldn't possibly be right. And this is the basis of his reasoning, which he lays down in a few short chapters with just one diagram, which is the one shown on the right. And effectively, he reasoned that the synthesis of blood in the liver couldn't possibly keep up with the cardiac output that of blood that he observed. That the time to exsanguination was meant that there was again meant that the liver could not possibly keep up with the rate of synthesis. Like Leonardo and others, Vesalius also alluded to this, he couldn't find any channels in the septum of the heart. And believe it or not, there was still a prevailing view that the blood vessels were filled with air and not with blood, and Harvey put that to bed. But the real discovery, or the real crux of his argument, when he was asked what was the most important feature, was that the valves in the veins implied unidirectional flow. So the idea that the blood was made in the liver and went out to the peripheries where it was consumed couldn't possibly be right. And that's what led Harvey to speculate on a circulation. So the circulation of blood actually took hold as a concept very quickly. These are images from around 2000, again using MRI, a slightly different technique to the one I showed you a few moments ago, but showing something rather similar, and looking on the left at venous flow through the right side of the heart, and on the right at the arterial flow patterns. And what I want to draw your attention to is quite how organized and structured these flows are. So the blood isn't just arriving in the heart and slopping around. It's actually following these very elegant, very highly choreographed chiral forms, which you'll see even more clearly in this. So this is the blood coming up from the inferior vena cava, from the lower half of the body, and down from the superior vena cava, and being drawn into this very, very elegant spiral, which effectively ejects it from the right atrium into the right ventricle. So without imaging techniques, none of this is at all apparent, and is certainly non-obvious. So I said that Harvey's ideas very quickly caught hold. This is the frontispiece from the first textbook that followed from Harvey's description. So this is by Nathaniel Highmore. Here is Galen and Hippocrates and the Janus straddling the past and the future, this very important transition point in science. But I want to draw your attention to this image, which is beneath the separated legs. And here is the idea that the blood is circulating rather like natural flows of water that come down into the rivers, that evaporate to the clouds and go round in this convection cycle. These two characters here, the derivatio and the revulsio, refer to bloodletting techniques. What I want to draw your attention to, though, is this little hand that's coming down from the cloud and is operating the pump that's making the water go round. And this, of course, is the hand of God. And the hand of God refers to the fact that even though the heart beats and even though the heart is at the center of the circulation, there is no plausible explanation for how the heart beats for itself. And that still is very much the realm of God. And when Descartes read of Harvey's discoveries, he didn't have any difficulty in recognizing the plausibility of the circulation of blood, but he said that this would lead to a much more complex question of how the heart actually beat for itself. What was the faculty that caused this motion? And that question is to hang over science from the middle of the 17th century, even earlier, until the 20th century, and we will solve it, or we will see how it was solved a little later. Jennifer, in her open comments, referred to the work in Oxford in the 17th century, and this was led very much by Thomas Willis, shown here on the left, Richard Lower, and although he's seen rather grandly in his portrait here, their lab assistant was Christopher Wren, and it was Christopher Wren who, as a young man, was responsible for the engravings of the anatomy of the base of the brain. So Thomas Willis was doing work injecting colored dyes into blood vessels. And the long and short of it is that he described this network of blood vessels in the base of the brain, which allowed for multiple inflows of blood, such that if any one was interrupted, there was redundancy in the system that allowed blood to be taken from one of the other inflows and distributed to the brain. And in that way, there was a safety mechanism, insurance, that allowed the brain to receive a constant flow of blood. And that concept and that knowledge is still very much important in stroke medicine and in neurosurgery today. But the engraving was done by Christopher Wren. And I think it's indicative of the very rich intellectual landscape of the day that Wren uses what he's learning working with the physiologists, and here is a CT angiogram of a contemporary imaging. Wren uses what he's learning from the physiologists to inform his design for the rebuild of the City of London after the Great Fire. So the king called for proposals, none of which incidentally were built, as to how the city could be rebuilt. And Wren's road structures are very strikingly similar to what he was representing in the flow of blood to the brain. And I think that reflects a couple of important concepts. One is circulation, and the other is this redundancy that allows for efficient supply and efficient access. Richard Lower, I mentioned a moment ago, was arguably the world's first cardiologist. He was the person that showed through a couple of very elaborate and flamboyant experiments that the heart can beat for itself. So in those days, there was still some doubt as to whether the heart was beating as a muscular pump or whether it was expanding and contracting rather as a response to the fermentation or ebullition, so-called, of the blood. And Lower did two really very dramatic experiments. One is where he took out a dog's heart, put it on the floor, and showed that even with no connection to the dog, it could continue to beat for a few pulses. The second was to replace the circulating blood volume of a dog with beer and wine and show that the blood wasn't necessary for the ongoing contraction of the heart, that this was an inherent property of the heart itself. He also drew these very elaborate fibers showing that the heart muscle structure is spiral, and that explains what we now know, which is that the heart wrings the blood out. It squeezes the blood out in a rotating form. And on the right, again, done work in Oxford, but now in the 21st century, MR techniques that show the diffusion of fluid along fiber tracts and allowed the delineation of more or less the same sorts of fibers that Lower had shown by dissolving away the heart muscle. The other great thing that Lower did was to show the innervation of the heart, how it's connected to the so-called autonomic nervous system, though we didn't recognize it as such at the time. But here we see the nerve fibers coming down onto the heart. And this image by Antonio Scarpa is probably the pinnacle. So these are very large format, almost, I would say, 3 feet high pages of anatomical engravings, and again showing with very high resolution and beautiful dynamic range the nerve fibers of the heart as they innervate the muscle directly. Now, I put this image in because it really, again, emphasizes quite how prominent anatomy was, how much trouble the anatomists were taking to depict what was the forefront of biological science of the day. And I think it's also fair to say that there was a lot of public interest. This wasn't confined to a scientific caucus. And I mention that because something remarkable happens in the 18th century, and that is that the sacred depictions of the heart change. And they change from these rather schematized, slightly powdery depictions of hearts to these very carnal, anatomical images of truly um, um, uh, bodily bodily hearts, which of course is something that is very much key in the Catholic tradition. But I think we've almost become blunted in our response to this. This is a really remarkable thing to see. This is an explanted human organ set in a sacred context. And what's even more remarkable is that we can trace back the origins of this transposition from the anatomical heart into sacred depiction to this image. So this is a representation of the vision of St. Mary Alacoque, who believed that Christ gave her his fleshy heart and that his heart dwelled within her. She depicted this in a vision, and she stipulated quite clearly that this wasn't just an image of the heart, this was the actual fleshy anatomical heart. And from this came the cult of the Sacred Heart, which became very prominent as promoted, especially by the Jesuits. And there's a rather charming inscription at the bottom in which the engraver Natois sort of rather apologetically explains that he hasn't just done these hearts out of his own craziness, but this is explicitly what he was instructed to do. And these hearts are then disseminated through the Novo-Hispanic world. I could show you some very beautiful images of how that takes hold. But in the interests of time, I'm going to fast forward to Frida Kahlo and to the early 20th century. And to understand how Frida Kahlo, who's one of the modern artists who uses the heart really in an extraordinary way, to understand how and why she did it, you need to know a little bit about her own biography. So she was born at the beginning of the 20th century. When she was 18 and planning to be a medical student, she had a very horrific accident in which she was impaled on a handrail in a trolleybus. And the handrail went right through her body and caused her lifelong injury. As you know, she married Diego Rivera twice. She had a very stormy relationship with Rivera. And she had a miscarriage in Detroit in 1932 while Rivera was showing in the city. Series of relationship traumas, including the relationship he had with her sister, divorce, remarriage, and eventually her early death. But the heart is something that she brings into an articulation of her own life experiences recurrently and with real deliberate and thoughtful purpose. So this is an image memory very well known in which Carlo's chest has a hole where the heart is. I don't know if you can see this. Traversing the heart is this rod. On each end of the rod is a tiny cupid, and we can imagine the rod swinging rhythmically, as might the heart, through this hole in the chest and inflicting something reminiscent of the pain that she would have experienced impaled on the trolleybus. At her feet is her explanted flaccid heart bleeding out and mixing with the water in the mud and the dust. And this idea of the explanted heart is something which is drawn arguably from ancient Aztec traditions in which the heart was sacrificed to the sun god as some replenishing and recirculation of life. It's also the case that Frida Kahlo's local church was dedicated to St. Catherine of Siena. And as I mentioned earlier, St. Catherine exchanged her heart with Christ. So this idea that the heart is containing and is moving and somehow has containable and relatable properties is something which I think Kahlo used very effectively. And interestingly, though I won't speak about it here, from a completely removed tradition, Edvard Munch in Norway around a little bit earlier was using almost the same motif. So I mentioned to you that Carlo wanted to be a medical student. When she was in Detroit having the miscarriage, she insisted that her doctors gave her an anatomy book, and in fact they refused to do it. But Diego Rivera brought her an anatomy book, and indeed he brought her this anatomy book. And what is remarkable about this, so this is a representation of the fetal, or the materno-fetal circulation, but she lifts this image and she uses it in the picture of the two Fridas. So on the left is the traditional Frida of Mexico, and on the right is the modern Frida. And Frida says this is herself said that this is something about the pain and anguish of her disrupted relationships with Rivera, and how he loved her when she was the ancient, the traditional Frida, and that somehow these personalities are separated. But one of the things which I think is very interesting is that how she's used, I believe, though she doesn't refer to it, this image also to reference the loss of the fetus. So here is the umbilical and fetal vessels. Here is the equivalent in the two Fridas, and you can see this is a clamped vessel just bleeding rather languidly onto her white skirts. And I think this is using a direct anatomical reference to convey something of the misery and anguish of the loss of the fetus. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end now, but I wanted to come back to this idea that the heart has assumed this place in our consciousness because it beats. And this is the quote that I gave you from a little bit earlier from René Descartes. And the real question, which had hung over the ages from Aristotle, describing the beating heart in the fetus as the origin of life, to Aquinas, who spoke about the heart in relation to the movement of the planets, to Pascal, who spoke of the mystery of the heart, and Descartes, how does it beat for itself? So this is Denis Noble, more or less as he is today. And Denis, you will know, is a emeritus fellow and a long and distinguished fellowship at Balliol Prefectus of Holywell Manor in his time. But in his 20s, in the early 1960s, as a graduate student at UCL, so before he had his PhD, Denis was engaged in trying to understand the question of how the heart beat for itself. And in the lockdown, I had the enormous privilege of discussing with Denis not merely the science of how he'd engage with this problem, but also whether or not he recognized that he was engaging with the question that had baffled all of those thinkers over the years, and in some sense was a question about the origin of life. And at that stage, I was writing the book about the heart and the history of the heart through its depiction. And Denis held up this page from his thesis in which he has reduced the origins of the heartbeat to columns of numbers. And what he'd done here was to, through a combination of experimentation and computation using UCL's only computer, and he persuaded them to let him use it through the night, he'd worked out the so-called pacemaker potential. And I'm not going to go into what that is in detail, except to say that what Dennis described was the changes in the electrical properties of the heart membrane that allowed it to beat rhythmically and automatically for itself and to reset and to do that cyclically. And he published this extraordinary finding as a single author letter to Nature in 1960. So, and then, of course, Dennis was in London. He came to Oxford subsequently. So there you have it. The heart is a muscular pump that circulates blood. Its rate and force of contraction are influenced by neurohormonal inputs, and its automaticity is affected by the repetitive cycling of ions across a semi-permeable membrane. And in some sense, the whole mystery of the heart might have been solved. And yet, even knowing that the heart is a pump and even knowing how it pumps, we have this enduring fascination with the heart. And you only have to look at our language, metaphor, poetry, or the images that are present all around the world to see how readily we can communicate through images of the heart. I've shown you here some slightly trite love hearts, but you'll also find some of the more nuanced connotations of the heart, such as the black spot depicted in contemporary images. And this is something I saw in North London on a disused railway line. Here's a graffiti artist. I saw her starting to draw a heart. I walked with my son a little way down, and by the time I'd come back, she'd finished and she'd drawn on the black spot. And I asked her why she did that. Where did it come from? And to my utter fascination, she couldn't tell me. It's something she'd intuited, she'd drawn it on. So I want to finish the Botticelli to Banksy with an image from Banksy. And again, just emphasizing how bizarre it is at some level that we choose to use this explanted human organ to depict things as mysterious as black spots, as universal as love, and how our tendency to do that has been utterly undiminished over around 4,000 years. So I think I'll stop, and I would love to chat about this more. I guess there'll be questions and comments popping up. Jennifer, back to you.
Gosh, thank you, Robin. That was so rich. And it's wonderful to, having read the book, to actually hear it come to life in your own words. It's such a treat. I should mention, as Robin just pointed out, that do feel free to start writing your questions in the little Q&A box, and we can kind of line those up. As Robin and I were just going to do a little in conversation, as I mentioned at the beginning, for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to give you a chance to think up your questions or comments, and then I will start addressing your questions one by one. Gosh, Robin, I think what your overview reminds us, certainly those of you who haven't yet had the chance to read Robin's fantastic book, is the great breadth that you cover in this book, the 4 millennia, but also the great depth that you go in, and you very carefully select your moments, but you build your story so beautifully. So the way the text is written is that you're given some information, much in the knowledge, much as the way the kind of the knowledge of the heart, its representation, its usage is built, of course, on the backs of others. But the way that you've structured your text is always referring back to, this is what we knew then, this is how it was nuanced, this is the event that enabled that kind of shift in thinking or that new discovery. And just hearing you talk again and thinking about reading the book, I'm struck by the way you've written the book is really like a series of encounters. And it's very personal, which is something that I really loved as well. So it's a series of encounters, your personal encounter, either with a scholar, an object, an artist, as you say, with the graffiti artist. It's so personal. And you always take a moment to kind of step back and think, why am I asking this question? I thought I was going this way. I met this person. I saw this object. It shifted. And I really liked that kind of self-reflection as you're writing. I could hear your voice as I read it. So I just encourage everyone else, if you haven't had the chance, to do pick up the book. You'll enjoy it tremendously. I'm so pleased you mentioned St. Catherine of Siena several times because I'm going to share my screen, and I've included this image, this object that is in your book. It's by one of my favorite artists, and it's one of my favorite objects in your book. And I thought we could talk about it a little bit. It is a painting by Sienese artist, Giovanni Di Paolo. It's quite a small panel in the Met in New York. And it would have formed a part of an altarpiece, probably for a church in Siena, incidentally, a church attached to a hospital, which might appeal to some of you. And you referred to St. Catherine of Siena, this 14th century saint, several times. But before we get to the actual subject that's being represented, you very eloquently in the book talk about Catherine's own writings. She was a very political figure, wasn't she? And how she talks about the kind of theological heart, as it were. I didn't know if you wanted to say a few things about her writings about the heart, her writings to Pope Urban in particular. She was quite a powerful woman, wasn't she?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm certainly not expert in this, but my understanding is that she used the heart she used the tension between the heart and the brain to negotiate or to elaborate ideas about the organization of the church.
Mm,
So the traditional view might have been that the Pope was the sort of brain of the church, and it was a top-down
mm,
control. But in her judgment, the politics of the moment required a more nurturing, uh, grounded church. Maybe a hub and spoke might be a more might be a contemporary analogy. So she had this idea that the church was not commanding but was nourishing, and she used the heart as a metaphor for the nourishing potential of the heart. Um, I
She also
think
talks about Christ as the heart. And
yes,
didn't he squeeze his own heart and kind of water, replenish the land with the blood from his heart? So she really starts using those heart metaphors in her writings, doesn't she?
yes. I mean, I imagine you could elaborate more than I can, but I think it's this idea of the heart as life source
Mm-hmm.
runs very deep. As I mentioned it of Aristotle, but here is this you know moist liquid containing organ,
Mm,
and when you're alive it's beating and it's warm and you're
mm.
warm, and when you're dead it stops and it's still and the liquid goes and it's congealed. So this idea of it being a source of something vital is really very potent.
The idea of it as a life source, but then also having kind of political inflections, I think is really fascinating. And then to just address the scene that we're looking at on the screen, this is something that her biographer, Raymond of Capua, writes about, but she herself also writes to the Pope describing this event, as it were, this mystical event, depending on how you want to interpret it, which this artist, Giovanni Di Paolo, has sort of merged. There are sort of three events that he's merged into one, where effectively as she writes to Pope Urban, she says, I have given my heart to Christ. She described, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. The second moment is then where Christ removes his own heart and gives his heart to her. So there's a kind of heart transplant exchange. And the third one is where she mystically levitates. So this artist has combined what looks to be all three events into one.
Yeah, and from recollection, there's also some dispute from her that there's a difference between her recollection and her biographer's interpretation, and
I
there's a little tension running there as well. But again, I think it's this idea of the heart, what it signifies and what it contains, is what I would take from it for this purpose: the nutrifying properties, the container properties, and the fact that it is also it's a transferable asset in that sense.
Mm.
rather like in the Giotto and the Scroveni, the idea that you can put something in the heart and hand it over, I think is interesting as a sort of proto-transplantation.
Yes, extraordinary. I wondered how, as someone who, operates on hearts, would think about that. This is sort of mystical version of that heart exchange is quite extraordinary, and all the qualities that come with the heart that are understood to be transferred with that heart.
Absolutely. And actually, of course, we're in a Balliol context in De Vogila's Heart and Sweetheart Abbey, and there was certainly a long tradition, the idea that there was something of the person contained within the heart.
Mm,
And for both sacred and political reasons, after death, you might want to retain the heart and to bury it. And there were some practical considerations. If you
mm.
had to repatriate a whole body, without refrigeration, and it's not the most practical thing, but you take the heart and bury the heart and still have something of the essence of the person. That was quite a widespread practice.
Without knowing, you have neatly segued into my next slide. Well, that's very nice setup. I hope everyone can see this slide okay. It is Donatello's bronze relief that's in the Santo in Padua. Bronze relief in particular is particularly hard of the composition. I've got a detail, so I'll show it to you in a moment. The lifeless body of a man. As you'll be able to see in the detail, his chest is being cut open. And then at the far left, there is a chest being opened and a heart being pulled out. And this is that extraordinary tale of, as you can see here, the miraculous of the avaricious man's heart, or the miser's heart, as it's also known. And I know this is a subject that's particularly interesting to you. I don't know if you want to say something about this relief. And there's a slightly better detail there. This is maybe the moral heart, I might call it.
Yes, so in the Basilica San Antonio, there's a different relief that I'm familiar with, where the actual heart is being held up on the trachea with sort of striations. Yeah.
Mm.
And it's the idea that you'll find the miser's heart buried with his money, and that was the discovery, was the miracle of his heart indeed, in his chest with his money.
Yes. And according to this particular account, it was Anthony of Padua who attended the funeral of this wealthy Tuscan man, and he didn't feel that he felt the funeral was too grand.
Got it. Okay. And there's actually, if you want to see, you can get there's a cast of this in the V&A.
Yes, which actually, curiously, you can see much better than when you go to Padua, because of course the altar itself is very far away. Yes, we must encourage people to go to the V&A. But what Anthony of Padua was commenting on is that this man had really not spent his money in a moral way and helped support the poor in particular, which of course is Anthony of Padua is one of his major causes. And so he says, well, this man's heart must be with his treasure, is one of the quotes. And of course, then they perform the surgery to find that out. In the same church, there is another relief, which I don't know if you know this one. It's much larger. It's carved in marble. It's
Yeah.
much easier to read, so to speak. So I thought that might be quite helpful. And in thinking about it in terms of some of the images you have in your book, certainly the ones around Vesalius and early prints around different kinds of surgeries that are going on, or of cadavers in particular. There's quite a similarity here, don't you think? I do wonder if Tullio Lombardo is looking at some of those prints as an inspiration.
Yeah. Well, I think it was probably accessible. I mean, particularly if you're in Padua. I mean,
Mhm.
here is the center of the anatomical world at the time,
Mm.
and I imagine it would have been, I didn't show, it wasn't entirely gratuitous showing the Musk images. I think that, we're talking about going to the moon. I think they were
Mm.
talking about anatomy, and, how we were discovering how the body was put together. I suspect that was just at the bleeding edge of science of the day. And so at some level, it's not surprising to me that the two things, one spilled into the other.
And the presence of this in the church, the two representations of this subject in the church being so carefully kind of represented. And just to point out, I think in this representation, I hope you can see my pointer there, I think that is the chest with the heart. And next time I go, I must take a closer look at the heart. You've now inspired me to see how anatomical or not, or stylized it is. This is my surprise image. So as Robin knows, but the rest of you don't know, I'm actually speaking to you from Naples today, because I've been working on 2 other projects here. And I went today to one of my favorite churches, as you can see here, the Piemonte della Misericordia, which many of you may know for the famous Caravaggio 7 Acts of Mercy. So I went there quickly on my lunch break to pay homage to Caravaggio. And I haven't been to Naples for quite some time, and I was really struck by these extraordinary contemporary sculptures that have been installed in the chapel since I last went. They are by this Belgian artist, some of you might be familiar with, Jan Fabre, who's also known as a choreographer and a filmmaker, and he has teamed up with a choral seller, and they have gifted these to the church. Each one sits in a different chapel, and each one responds to the painting above the altarpiece. So the distinct relationship is being drawn out between the object and the painting. I won't go into all of them, but I hope what you can immediately see is that the point in common is the kind of naturalistic and pseudo anatomical heart in all of them. And I thought, gosh, it's so interesting here to bring, and you've now trained me to be looking for hearts everywhere. And here I was confronted, not expecting them. They're anatomical hearts, they're beautiful hearts. There are any number of different kind of ideas about what the heart might be, different theological associations. So I've brought some details to show you. So Robin, I don't think you've seen these before. Have you heard of these?
I have not.
Okay, good. So this is the one I thought we could focus on very briefly. This is the one that is in the chapel adjacent to the Caravaggio, here with the pseudo-anatomical heart with the lilies emerging out of the top. And I was thinking about the way you write about the early understandings of the heart as a vessel, you know, a vase in a sense. And here, of course, the coral lilies are meant to evoke the Virgin Mary. For those of you who don't remember the painting, I thought I'd just include it here. So we have the Virgin Mary at the very top, suspended between 2 angels, and she's carrying the Christ child. And then at the far left on our screen is this figure of the Philistine with the jawbone. This is Samson. And that's what you can see here. So that's a jawbone supporting a heart, from which lilies emerge. And there's a kind of misunderstanding of the jawbone here, but effectively in a mistranslation of the Hebrew text. It was understood as Samson, after defeating the Philistines, the 1,000 Philistines with jawbone, rock and the effusion of water that he drank from, but the idea that it's life-giving. And those are all merging in a kind of interesting way here. So I just thought I'd ask you what you thought about these objects.
Well, they're stunning, aren't they? And you know, this idea of the heart as a receptacle or as a vase, sometimes in the Book of the Dead, the Egyptians would just represent the heart as a vase. And there are certainly Leonardo, in fact, was someone who drew the heart as a germinating seed, with the vessels coming off as if they're a radical and you know, the root and the sprout coming off. So I think this is these are things which are perhaps influenced or perhaps just so easy to intuit because of the branching structures and the sort of allusions to nature, but they're very striking.
Let's see if I've got a few more. There's a detail of the Samson and the jawbone. Some details. I thought this was quite interesting with the ivy leeks, although they look more maple here. And your discussion about the early thoughts about the stylized shape of hearts, the non-atomical heart, being potentially associated with ivy. And this again is called the rebirth of life, so life-giving.
Right, so you're alluding to the one of the theories as to how we come to the heart motif is that it's a derivation from an ivy leaf, which was a symbol of enduring love.
Much more heart-shaped than
right.
that was.
I don't think that's where it's come from, but I can't exclude it. It might have come from multiple sources.
Hearts and keys, unlocking hearts, and caged hearts. And in this case, the liberty of compassion, so chained hearts that are then liberated. So strong, but I guess create a nice dialogue with the themes, particularly the theological themes that are being drawn out of the paintings. But I thought quite dramatic to go in to look at one of the world's most dramatic painters and see that work beside it. And these will now be permanent installations. They've been gifted to the church. I think we better open up for discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And we've got lots of questions coming up. If you don't mind, Robin, I'll just jump right in.
Good.
So one of the questions is, how long did it take for the dissemination of the findings of Harvey, Lower, and Willis to bring the practice of bloodletting to an end?
I can't answer that directly, except that in the 10 years that Harvey was thinking about divulging his discovery, one of the things that he was terrified of was destroying the the financial prospects of his colleagues, because bloodletting was one of the few things that you could do. So I don't know how long it took to die away, but probably quite quickly, I would think, because it becomes completely irrational once you accept the circulation of the blood. And circulation of the blood was certainly adopted as an idea very quickly.
Thank you. There's another interesting question here about, could you say something about the ancient Egyptian understanding and depiction of the heart?
Yeah, so that's probably an allusion to the heart in the Book of the Dead, which I spoke of very briefly. So the heart had a special place. It was weighed in the ceremony of Mat, and the weight of the heart against Osiris' feather was the determinant of whether or not you were fit for the transition to the afterlife, which is interesting in itself. But the other interesting thing, I think, is that's a metaphorical weighing, because the heart, unlike the other organs, was embalmed and then replaced in the body. So everything else went into canopic jars, but the heart was deemed essential for the dead person in the afterlife, and was returned, and was indeed a petitioner on behalf of the dead person, a petitioner for the propriety or rectitude of that person and their right to passage.
Thank you. It's hard to sum an entire tradition up in, but that was beautifully put. And you discuss it very beautifully in the book as well. There's one question that many people would like to know the answer to, which is, do you think investigations like yours influence clinical work? And if so, how?
Right. So, ultimately, I was motivated to do this because I had a very strong sense from early life that the heart was the most important bit. And the reason I say that is because it turned out from my investigation that I was one of many people who'd had this sense that the heart was the most important bit. And from my clinical work, I think it's helped me to empathize more with why my patients are so concerned about heart problems in a way that they might not be if they've got a slip disc or a blocked ear. It has such deep-seated connotations. And so, if anything, it's given me a little bit more empathetic insight into that side of my interaction.
Thank you. There's a slightly related question here, where Christine Borgman asks, well, she first of all says a brilliant reflexive discussion on the interplay between art and science. It does not appear to be available in the US until July, and it also has a different cover. So it's only available
Oh,
in the UK edition, is that right? And what are you going to do a US book tour?
I would love to. Christine, hello, nice to hear from you. I didn't know it had a different cover. Yes, it comes out in the US in July, and I'm hoping to do something in early July in New York, and open to all possibilities. I mean, I just love sharing the story. I hope you can tell. But yeah, I'd love to do something there.
Well, here we are. We have a forum of people who can surge up and support this if they're in the US. There's a wonderful question here about something you do touch on, actually more than touch on in the book. Could you tell us a bit about how other ancient civilizations like the Chinese, Indian, Hindu cultures have depicted the heart over the centuries? Was it similar to Europe or quite different?
Um, quite different, really, but with similarities. So visual depictions aren't always as rich, but the ideas and the attributes are often shared. So there are passages in the Upanishads which are very much related to ideas that I've already brought forth about the seat of the soul, source of life, heart position of the cosmos, source of semen. Those are both Eastern and Western ideas. The Chinese traditions, to my reading, are not so, they're differently conceived. So others will know far more about this than I do. But if you look in Chinese medical textbooks, you're much more likely to see illustrations of flora and plants and medicinal preparations, and much less likely to see some sort of physiological unpicking. If you go to Indian later depictions, to Tibet, you'll see the heart as a lotus flower. And the
Yes.
idea is that the heart opens and closes. So there's a movement like the lotus flower. But again, the depictions are not strictly anatomical, well, clearly. And the chakras, for instance, the shown are not structures, but they're ways of conceiving function rather than depicting function.
I'll just sum up. There's some beautiful, I mean, many enthusiastic responses and some offers of where you can come to the US and present. So there's some encouraging support there already. One question that is dear to my heart, from Douglas Craig, who says, do you think medical students would benefit from a year studying philosophy and history of art as part of medical training? No pressure on this.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, yes, undoubtedly. But,
There we go.
but
Neat answer there.
I mean, it's difficult to fit everything in. The medical curriculum is so enormous, but I think, at the very least, we can hope to expose some of this interdisciplinarity, and so that it plants seeds that people develop over a lifetime.
And we can have more of these kind of discussions between the different fields, which are so rich. I learn so much from you, and then I come up with ideas of things I want to show you, and we can kind of unpack together.
Well, and again, I don't know, my experience of being a fellow in Balliol is some form of replication of my experience of being a student in Balliol, which I get to speak to people who are reading books that I've never heard of and thinking about things in ways that I can't conceive. And that's the joy of it. So I think, to the extent that we can do that, you mentioned that Elena Lombardi was the person that kicked this whole thing off. Well, she's a professor of medieval Italian literature,
Yes.
but she has an insight that I could approach. And so it's been a great pleasure speaking with and learning from Eleanor through this project as well.
I think we're going to have to wrap up. I'm trying to synthesize one longer question, which touches on Charles Taylor, who speaks of the disenchantment of magical/religious views by science and a re-enchantment in modern times. The question is hinging around that point. And Rag asks, do you see some underlying connection on how the scientific depiction interacts with a Taylor-like view of things? So she's asking about, or he is asking about, re-enchanting depictions of the heart.
Yes, I mean, to the extent that I think it's really unhelpful and unedifying, to try and reduce things to their component parts,
Mm.
not least the science. And it's a much richer understanding of who we can be as humans to try and understand our intuitions and our histories and the things that we've evolved to be and to appreciate, which exist alongside but not necessarily apart from, scientific understanding. Yes, I think I choose to embrace those things.
Mm.
I don't think it's necessary or unnecessary, but I think it's a richer life if you do.
And I've just been asked to do one more question. I can't say no. Let me have a quick look. This is from David Farrar. Great talk. How does current neuroscience inform our understanding of brain-heart interactions? Do different nerves from the heart go to emotional parts of the brain? So brain-heart interactions.
Yes. So I couldn't profess any particular expertise here. I mean, there clearly are connections between the autonomic nervous system, which controls heart function, and the brain. In the book, I touch on the idea of the transplanted heart, which becomes denervated, so it doesn't have any nerves. I don't think that there are major emotional upsets from not having your heart plumbed or connected electrically to your brain, but it's not the same.
You do also talk about heartbreak being a literal thing,
Yes,
and
I
being
do.
associated with losing a loved one, and that. So perhaps that's to
Yeah,
direct
that might.
people to that chapter of your book.
You're right. That's a better example, actually, Jennifer. I mean,
Just come to me,
this
David.
Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, the broken heart syndrome, wherein some intense physical or emotional stress, we think through an outpouring of sympathetic adrenaline type stimulation, paralyzes the heart or a portion of it. And that can be fatal in about 4% of cases, but usually it recovers. But it is a broken heart. The reason it's called Takotsubo is because that's the Japanese word for an octopus pod, and it has a constricted end with a bulge, and that's what the heart looks like on angiography.
It's a bit sad to end on a broken heart.
Most of 96% of the time it gets better. So that's
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. That was the number we wanted to hear. I think on that note, we have to thank you for your extraordinary research and for sharing it with us. Thank you, everyone, for your brilliant questions. We got through almost all of them. They'll be there saved in the chat for you. And I am bid to announce our next lecture, if you don't mind, which will take place Tuesday, the 18th of February. It will be Professor Heather Sharkey, and she's talking on also an extraordinary subject, the Sudanese giraffe who went to France, the life and afterlife of Zarafa from 1824 to 2024. So that's on Tuesday, the 18th of February. So thank you, Robin. This has been absolutely tremendous. And thank you,
Jennifer, thank
IT
you.
team behind the scenes for helping this go smoothly. Really enjoyed our chat. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm happy to engage. If anyone does want, I have a Balliol email address. Very happy to receive comments or questions if there's anything outstanding. But
Yes,
thank you for
we get to
engaging with
address
us
them.
so
Great.
enthusiastic.
Thanks so much.